Welcome to Battlechat number 5. This interview with Richard Tyndall and Laurence Baldwin was recorded on the 11th of May 2018. Enjoy the show. Well, hello everyone, all my Patreon subscribers who are getting 48 hours exclusive access to this exciting interview that I'm having with Trix and Laurence, who organised the Partizan show. So first of all, let's say hi. Hi Trix, hi Laurence.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thanks for joining me from sunny, whereabouts are you? Up in Nottingham somewhere?
Lincolnshire, Ancaster. The old Roman town.
Oh, wow, fantastic. Lincolnshire, so you can see for miles and miles and miles.
We're on the only hilly bit.
Oh, are you? Yeah,
Yeah.
because Lincoln's sort of hilly and then there's this other bit, isn't there? That's right. In fact, I was driving back from Yorkshire when must have gone quite close to where you live, actually, last weekend, because I was organising a big Imaginations weekend up in Ayton in Yorkshire. And that was fun. Complete madness, actually. But there we go. Anyway, so I shall explain to patrons why it is that, in fact, I was sort of my recent association with Partizan has come about, because obviously I've been going to Partizan as a show and the other Partizan since probably about 2006, something like that, which is now, God, that's a dozen years already, isn't it? My God. But when I started my Patreon gig, you very kindly approached me and said, Henry, we would like you to cover the Partizan and the other Partizan shows. And we understand that it's quite a journey for you and that, you know, you're a professional at this kind of thing. So here's an offer to cover your expenses for doing so. And I said, gosh, that's brilliant. That's amazing. That's great. Thank you very much indeed. But I want to make sure that I've got complete independence about how I report the show. I don't want people to say, oh, well, he would say that because, you know, he's been bribed by Trix and Laurel. You very kindly and straight immediately, without any negotiation, said, yes, absolutely, that's what we want you to do. I think the phrase you used was warts and all, wasn't it?
Absolutely, yes.
Which is fantastic. So obviously more than happy to do so. So what that means is next week, it's on the 20th, isn't it? I believe.
Yes.
Sunday the 20th of May 2018, I will be at the Newark Showground, and I'm travelling up the day before to make sure I'll be there. I will be at the Newark Showground inside the hall, looking at all the games, meeting the traders, meeting the punters, finding out what people think, and generally, I hope, having a jolly good time in what I hope will be brilliant British weather. I'm touching some wood here because it's been a bit variable lately. So that's, folks, how this came about. But obviously, I've known you guys probably since about 2006. I first met you, I imagine, when the show was in its previous venue. But we'll kind of get to that. And so effectively, what I'd like to do to start is get you to introduce yourself to people, because, you know, whilst we sort of assume, and the British wargaming scene is quite a tight-knit community, and I think probably many, if not most, British wargamers have made it at one time or another to one of the Partizan shows. Obviously, some of my patrons and some of the people listening to this when it goes public are from the four corners of the earth, and don't necessarily know you guys from Adam. So could you sort of tell people a bit about your own journey into the hobby and how you got started?
Shall I go first? So
yeah.
I'm a southerner like yourself, Henry. I was originally brought up in Hastings.
Oh, right.
So my first wargaming was, I'm old enough that my first wargaming was Featherstone books from the library and Airfix Napoleonics, and there was a Hastings Wargames Club, and I'm not sure if it's still there because it's a long time since I've been living down that part of the world.
Go on, tell us how long, Laurence. How long has it been?
How long? 82 I left.
Oh, right. There may be some people who remember you.
Yeah, let's hope so. So around 1982, I moved up to Newark. I was still at university at the time, and a brand new wargames magazine called Miniature Wargames came out. So I picked it up from the W.H. Smith at university and thought, oh, this is good. We've not had a proper wargames magazine for a while. I wonder who's running it. And it was a chap called Duncan McFarlane, who lived in Newark, where I'd recently moved to. So eventually I got hold of him and said, is there a club in Newark? Because I've only recently moved there. And he said, no, why don't we start one? Or Duncan, being Duncan, I think, said, why don't you start one? I kind of did. And the rest is history. A couple of years after that, we started Partizan, originally in the Grove Leisure Centre.
Which is no more.
It's recently been knocked down. And then we moved from there to Callum Hall, and we'll get onto that story a bit later on, I guess.
Tell us something about your personal tastes in wargaming. And were you always in a historical wargame, or did you specialise in ancients or Napoleonics? Or
I always think of myself as a Napoleonic wargamer, but I've actually got very few Napoleonics. With the club, I've tended to sort of join in with what other people have been doing. So my recent promise to myself is that I would start doing more Napoleonics. So I've also found that I can't see very well to paint, so I'm having to relearn how to paint Napoleonics. So that's my quest.
It's quite a challenge. I mean, I think we're all of a certain age, I think we could say, where the eyes and fingers aren't as compliant as they used to be. And I certainly find that I'm having to think really hard about whether I continue using a black undercoat, because there are times when the tip of the brush just disappears into some sort of void.
Yeah, I've always been a white undercoat man, but I've recently had to buy some reading glasses to actually see what I'm painting.
Well, there you go. I got an Optivisor thing, so I've got the whole hog. What about you, Trix? I mean, what's your kind of wargaming background?
Well, I'm the same. I think probably the same as everybody. I started off with Featherstone and those books, and with the Airfix stuff when I was a kid. And then in 1980, I went to America on a school exchange. And I discovered Dungeons and Dragons, and there was a group of American kids I was playing Dungeons and Dragons with, and they bought some figures out one day and said, "Oh, look, these were made in your hometown." Oh, okay. So I then came back to Newark.
And they were early Citadel miniatures.
Early Citadel, that's right. Yes, yeah. When it was still on, actually at that time it was still on Millgate in Newark, and then I hunted it down, and Duncan McFarlane was the general manager there at the time. Yeah. And so I got a job working there straight away, actually just packing on a Saturday, and got to know Duncan and started doing a bit of wargaming with him. And we were talking earlier, it was my first proper historicals. I remember going to his house, and I don't know if you ever went to one of Duncan's houses, but they were full from ceiling to floor with books and figures, and you literally couldn't walk through the rooms, and it was all up the stairs. He just had so much stuff, it was amazing. So for me, it was in Aladdin's cave. But because of that, you couldn't play a traditional war game. He had a war games room upstairs that we used later, but it was time, it wasn't possible. So he started this game using Renaissance figures, whereby every clear surface was a different part of the battlefield. And you had to send in, so you had a table, the mantelpiece, the bookshelf, and you had to then send instructions. It was a wonderful introduction to sort of the whole complexity of, because you're having to send instructions from one unit to another rather than just moving them. You've got to order this unit, and it'll take a certain number of turns before the instruction gets to that unit, depending on how far away it is on which bookshelf. And,
oh my God, that's brilliant!
It was fabulous. And then I then headed off to university, and at some point just after I came back from university, I think they started the club, and that's when I met Laurence.
So the Newark Irregulars is the thing that brought you together?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about sometime in the 1980s?
Again, it would probably be about 84, 85. I think I was home from college. I was at university till 86, and I think I'd just come home from college. and came along and met Laurence, and I can't remember what we were playing at the time, but we were still in an old room upstairs above a pub in Newark at the time, and then eventually moved to the Scout Hall where we had the club for many years. So, but one of our running jokes has been back in the late 90s. I then started an archaeology club, and the only night the archaeology unit could meet was on a Wednesday night, which is when the irregulars met.
Oh, right.
So actually, since that day, I think Laurence has one photograph of me from a Hammerhead show a couple of years ago, where I'm actually playing a game, and that's the first game I'd played in about 15 years.
Seriously,
I am a fanatical wargamer. I love everything about the hobby and the game. I just never get a chance to play.
I kind of understand that because I never played so few war games as when I was the editor of a war games magazine. Yeah. It just, when it becomes part of your business, if you like, it all the other stuff takes over. And I know there have been a number of people disappointed because they imagine I've probably got this vast collection of painted miniatures that I've been beavering away at, and surely you must play several games a week. And the answer is no, I haven't. People also
we had the same thing, certainly for me, for a long while. Although the club was still running at the time, it felt like my main hobby was running war games shows.
Yeah, I can fully understand that. So, Partizan itself, now you mentioned it first started somewhere completely different, not even in Kelham Hall.
Yeah, it was at next to my old school, the Grove Sports Centre. We used to meet at the Grove pub, which was next to the school.
Right.
The Grove Sports Centre was where we had the first, I think, 2 shows.
2 or 3, I can't remember. At the time, the National War Games Championship or whatever it was had regional events, so we ran the East Midlands regional. So although we don't do competitions now, actually, when we first ran, we did have a regional event running within the show.
And then what we did is we had Duncan at the time had this amazing range, his own range of Mulburian figures, which I think all ended up at the War Games Holiday Centre eventually.
Yeah.
And so we ran just a few participation games, basically to invite people to come and have a game, just small sort of 2x2 games, just to give them an idea of playing their own. So we had a series of these running.
Yeah.
So I mean, I wasn't actually running the show at that time. I think I was assigned to run the participation games whilst Laurence and Duncan got on with the actual show. So.
Oh, I see. Okay. So that would have been what, back in 1980 something, was that?
86 was the first one,
86?
Yeah.
Wow, that's quite some heritage you've built up.
We've grown old.
Yeah. Because 1986, I think, was the year I had that article that Duncan published, my article on fictitious wargaming, which was in it may have actually been the last issue of Miniature War Games that he edited before he then went off. So that was 86. So it was all happening at that time. That's an interesting sort of coincidence. So was the show organised just by you guys, or was the whole club involved? How did it work when you first started?
Yeah, to begin with, it was Duncan and myself did most of the organising, but the club was still running at that time, so we had plenty of people to, for example, run a bring and buy and man the door and stuff like that. So yeah, it was very much a club event to begin with. Over the years, the club has suffered from, I mean, we were called the Irregulars because we were irregular. Most people actually moved away from Newark one way or another. So Richard lives in Manchester now. I live in Nottingham. I only lived in Newark for 2 or 3 years. But everyone else who was the core part of the club have moved away to Bingham or Nottingham or, so away. Yeah. So, there are several clubs in Nottingham now that I would say have got most of our old members.
Yeah, because I mean, I know there's a couple of key figures. Straight off the top of my head, Steve Jones and James Morris are 2 guys who I firmly associate with the Newark Irregulars, but I think both of them live in Nottingham, in fact.
Steve actually lives, he just lives just a little away from here at Long Bennington, so it's sort of halfway between where I am and Newark. I mean, the main sort of junta that was myself and Laurence and Duncan and John Lang. From Ratham, and who does the sort of the casting and stuff. And so we used to meet up, I think, in a cafe upstairs in Newark, and plan out the floor plan on the back, literally on the back of a piece of paper. And then we sort of we got it a little better organised eventually.
John Lang used to have a theory that all you need to do for a show is book the hall, book some tables, and then throw it together.
Yeah.
It's got a bit more complicated than that since then.
I think we call that organic, don't we?
Yes. So then in '93, I actually got married at Kelham Hall.
Oh, did you?
And yeah, so it was because it was hosting weddings at the time.
Because it's council offices, wasn't it?
It was council offices then, yeah. But they used to host weddings and all sorts of things. It was a lovely place.
Wow.
We nicked the floor plans they sent through for my wedding to show which rooms would be available. We basically photocopied them in and rescaled them, and then I used them from that point on for the whole of the rest of the period we were at Kelham Hall to make sure that everything was to scale, to fit the tables in, to make sure I could fit everything in.
Fantastic.
And we've kind of devolved down to a state where I run the floor plan and the invitations because I work away so much. Then Laurence is the one it all falls on for doing it on the day. So we split everything in that way. So
I mean, we've already mentioned kind of Kelham Hall there, and my memories of it is this amazing, from the outside, this amazing looking Victorian Gothic building. And when you get inside, it's rather labyrinthine, divided up into lots of not terribly convenient spaces. And you've got the main hall, which is kind of full of Stygian gloom, isn't it? It's got this massive, it's an amazing thing, this massive domed ceiling, rather sort of Byzantine in appearance, isn't it? But the one major factor that it lacks is light. and I can remember over the years, because you're a keen photographer as well, Trix, over the years, and many of us who tried to take photos of war games at shows have developed interesting methods of trying to get as much light as possible into our pictures, including a few years ago, I think it must have been the last year you were at Kelham Hall, I made this rig with kind of spotlights on it and stuff, battery-powered spotlights, which made it hard to actually hold the camera steady. But
see, there was a long time there was an additional problem with it because when they were hosting weddings or big events there, they had a sprung wooden floor, which they laid down and which they then took away sometimes afterwards. But a lot of the time, the wooden floor would still be there. And so what happened is you'd set up, and if you want to do a long exposure for a photograph, as soon as anybody walked by, your camera did this.
Yes, you bounced.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
so
fantastic.
It was a nightmare for that. I mean, I'd love to say that now I can remember the reasons why, because when we were looking at moving to other places, we did for a while have a look, but we couldn't find anywhere that was really suitable. And when it was sort of getting to the point of we're going to have to move, I was very opposed. I was of the I think we should just stop. And Kelham Hall is it for me, and that was it.
Right.
And I would love, having now done a few years at the showground, I'd love to be able to say I know why that was, but I can't remember why that was. I look back and I think, why did I want to do that?
Why were you so resistant?
Yeah, it was.
Well, I think it had an atmosphere, and the architecture is glorious. It is Victorian High Gothic at its best, but the atmosphere was great in some respects. But looking back, we should have moved sooner.
I mean, it did limit us hugely. I mean, I know most shows obviously have a trader waiting list, and we have the same as most shows with that. But we had quite an extensive gamers waiting list because I could probably, on a good day, I could fit about 26 or 27 games into the show. And then you'd panic when you'd invite the right number of games and someone would come along and say, I've got a 28-foot game I want to put on. Because of that, you invite them, you can't really say no. So that was always my big concern. And now, I think we've got 61 or 62 games at the show in next week.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal change, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I agree with you, Laurence, about that kind of feel that Kelham Hall had, because it wasn't just the hall itself, it was the surroundings as well, this parkland surroundings and stuff. I mean, you'd be sitting out there having a sandwich and bunnies would hop by, quite literally, which is a fairly unique sort of location. And sometimes there would be other events like lots of tents or caravans. And, of course, there was the one famous time a few years ago when it was Partizan Partizan in the park, and everything moved into giant marquees outside. Well, explain to people how that happened. Well, how did that come about?
Okay, that was a bit of a disaster.
We might be a bit careful about this.
Of course.
To avoid litigation, basically, we book the dates a year or two ahead, as you would.
Yeah.
About 4 weeks before that particular show, we were ringing up just to check on arrangements, and as you do, and they said, "Hang on, which day did you say?" And our contention is, because we plan ahead, our contention is they had written down the date wrong, and the Antiques Fair booked in the hall.
Oh dear!
They weren't prepared to cancel the Antiques Fair. They were happier to lose us. So we had an agonised week or two when we went, so what do we do?
Yeah.
Do we can the whole thing? That would be expensive, letting down a lot of people, or do we look for another way to do it? And eventually we made a small loss that year because we had to hire a marquee and flooring, and we went ahead. And I think, going back to your point about the lighting, that was kind of the last straw.
Yeah.
Because we were lucky, we had really good weather. It was quite sunny, and actually the diffused light through the canvas made for brilliant photography conditions.
It did, actually.
Yeah, and as we went back into the hall the year after, everyone went, actually, this is much worse than we remember.
And there was also an element of I think I can probably say we genuinely started to get the impression we weren't wanted.
Yeah.
Things being fixed. I think poor old Dave Ryan from Caliber Books, he always had the chapel and basically had his stand in there. And it got so bad because he was effectively working in the dark because they couldn't fix the light. And it was just, we got the very clear impression we weren't wanted anymore.
Yeah, went to a new management. Their long-term aim, I think, is now the council have moved out to develop the building into a hotel complex.
Right.
And there were other sorts of events there. So even though we were filling the hall, we had every single room that was for hire. We didn't really fit their business plan.
So the council they've actually sold Kelham Hall, have they?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, that does give you a big clue, because I can imagine an events organisation or something of that kind moving in, taking over, would probably have a particular style of event that they want to be associated with, and probably several hundred wargamers coming through the door isn't the style that they're necessarily looking for. Though, of course, we are all men of the greatest high style, of course. But that's really interesting. So that, in a sense, was what triggered your search for a different venue. This realization that
it wasn't much of a search, because we already had a look at some venues a couple of years before, 3 or 4 years before, because we were looking to expand the show. And as I say, we'd had a situation back in the late 90s. And one of the reasons that we had to get rid of the Bring and Buy was because we were visited one year by the fire brigade, who basically said, you're going to have to shut down, or you're going to have to move people out because you've just got too many people in here. It was the first year, I think, we nearly got to 1,000 people, visitors, and then you've got the traders and the gamers on top of that. And we were just, we had a Bring and Buy, which was a real choke point. So we actually, from that point on, we were making a point of trying to limit the numbers of people coming.
Yeah.
Removing things like the Bring and Buy. So we'd looked around for other places, but you went to Nottingham and it was costing £10,000 a day for the Nottingham Conference Centre, or Southwell Racecourse, where it's up 2 flights of stairs. It just wasn't. There was nothing suitable. And so what actually did it, of course, was Hammerhead. Hammerhead.
That's Sally and Paul.
Sally and Paul, that's right, yeah. Well, we used to run 3 shows, because we used to run the 2 Partisans and the Fantasy Partisan, which was really the baby of John Lang. He was very keen on that as a separate fantasy and science fiction show, which for us was a great idea.
Well, because he was running RAFM, wasn't he?
That's right, yes, yeah. And I think he just liked the idea of there being a separate fantasy and science fiction show, which I thought was fantastic.
Yeah.
We ran it for a few years, but really it was getting too much for us. Running 3 shows a year was just too much. And we were then looking at, so which show do we drop? And that show being as it was in February.
Yeah.
Fun enough, of course, this is the first year it suffered from the thing we always dreaded, which was, bad weather having to cancel, which was terrible because it was a month later. So you would have thought they would have been okay. But yes, so we decided to can that one. And I think Duncan and some of the traders at that point really wanted it to carry on. So I think COGS came in first, the Chesterfield Open Gaming Society.
Right.
They took it over for a few years, and then Sally and Paul took it over.
Yeah.
And they made the incredibly brave move to go to the bigger venue, which in the end made the choice for us very easy.
Yeah, sure.
Because in a way that they'd already sort of forged ahead and done the move, so we knew that it was workable.
Yeah, and in fact, I remember at their first Hammerhead, I was up there running a little demo game, and I bumped into you guys who you were kind of doing a reconnaissance mission to check out the venue.
Yeah,
and obviously it made a good impression because obviously, the Newark Showground venue, they've obviously spent a huge amount of money on developing that site, the vast amounts of parking, and I think they're still adding new bits, aren't they?
They are. I mean, the interesting thing was if we'd gone there, well, we had looked at it 10 years ago, probably more than that, 15 years ago, and it simply wasn't suitable. It was the venue for the agricultural show, so it consisted of a large number of sheds, which were great for car shows, that sort of thing. Yeah. And they were also, it then had the one, what's now become part of Hammerhead, which is the pavilion. Right. And that was the only part of it at the time which really was suitable for holding a comfortable showing. The rest of it was very windy and cold and just wasn't suitable. So it's part of what they've done is made the change.
Yeah, absolutely. So now that the change has happened, I mean, how are you feeling about the show now it's got its new venue?
I think it's been a very positive thing. I mean, someone asked me what I missed about the old place, and the architecture is pretty much the only thing I miss now. Kelham Hall. I think it did make us think differently about what we were going to do, because we'd got into a position over the years where, because of the constriction on space, we'd focused on what we still see as our core element, which is beautifully presented games. So some of our shows previously, there'd been hardly anything to join in with. So we made a conscious decision to go for this zoning system that we have now. So we have all the demonstration games in one area, have all the participation games in another area, and then we also have the societies, the history zone that promotes some of the societies.
Yeah, and authors now I notice as well.
Well, we had authors we had one author came, Andy Johnson, come along. He came along 2 or 3 shows at Kelham. And that was very successful. And then because he was doing other things, he wasn't writing new stuff at the time. But then once we'd moved to the showground, it was through Simon Miller. Simon Miller, friend of Harry Sidebottoms, or knew Harry, and sort of was asked if they could come along, and we were like, yeah, great, and it's something. It's something I'd really like to expand. There's a thing about the philosophy of the shows. People sort of ask, and we did used to ask ourselves about why do you run the shows? And we don't have a club anymore. Obviously, we're not. They're not our shows to the extent that we couldn't take anything from them. The whole philosophy of the shows is basically we want to run the sort of show, the dream show that we'd like to go to.
Absolutely.
So we're always looking for the ways to do that in such a way that improves the show without necessarily, if we don't need it, without necessarily bringing in any more money. So we weren't interested in increasing the number of traders. So the society stuff particularly was something I've liked the idea of for a long time, is to allow the societies to come along and just promote themselves. And I think it just adds to the whole aura of the show, if you see what I mean.
It does.
Stops it. We don't want it to be somewhere you just go to shop or somewhere you just go to look at games. It needs to be something that that you get something more out of, some real inspiration out of.
I think it's a bit pretentious to talk about the philosophy of the show, but that's kind of where we're at. We're trying to make a show that is the show that we would want to go to, but bring something different. I think nowadays there's a lot of shows around, and you need to kind of have a niche.
Yeah.
Our niche developed into the pretty demonstration games, partly because of where we are. We're in the lead belt, so a lot of very good, high-quality wargamers are around. Lots of ex-workshop people or current workshop people. So we get the quality of games that you don't see necessarily at other shows. And obviously, to begin with, Duncan was running a magazine, so he was taking photographs. Yeah. The reputation, it just built upon itself. So we've consciously kept to that. We've increased the participation thing, but we don't want to be the northern version of Salute, for example. Salute does that very well.
Yeah.
We do something else. And Hammerhead, to be fair, does something else. Yeah. It focuses just on participation games. Yeah. So, I think shows have to have a reason for being, and our reason is the aesthetic, the photography, the most beautiful games around.
I mean, certainly as just someone in the hobby, and I think I would speak for most people when I say that we associate the Partizan shows with quality, not quantity.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing has been, since you've moved to the new venue, that's obviously given you a certain amount of elbow room to increase the quantity of high quality stuff, if that makes sense. And I think it is interesting that you've introduced this zoning thing, because obviously, when you turn up at the hall, the showground, it's basically a big kind of square box with a high roof and lots of light coming in, which is a photographer's dream. But also the danger could be that it just becomes an aircraft hangar.
Yeah.
And it just becomes a slightly smaller aircraft hangar than Salute or Crisis or whatever. So I think it's quite interesting that you're consciously trying to sort of divide up that space in a meaningful way. Yeah. I don't actually think it's pretentious at all. I think, to be honest, as someone who's organised completely different, professional events myself in the past, I think that is something you do need to think about, because it gives the visitors kind of points of reference as they're going around. I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, you'd have much more money at your disposal, and you'd actually be able to divide things up into zones, and what have you. But I think it's a good ambition to have, and I mean, obviously. One of the other things that I think people associate Partizan with is you often are seen as reflecting the latest trends in the hobby. That some of the leading people come and put on their demonstration games and so forth at your shows. How conscious are you that many people see what they find at Partizan to be kind of cutting edge?
Actually, honestly, until you say that, not at all. I've never really. You see, we've had these people around for almost as long as we've been running the shows. I think it was very early on in sort of maybe even before we left the Grove Sports Centre, that I think we got maybe the Perry twins came and put a game on or something like that. I know at the very first show, I was talking to Rick Priestley at the age of 17 or something, or 18, and saying, I was a bit older, maybe 20, I want to go and work for a wargames company. And he turned around and said, don't do it. So,
wise words.
Yeah, exactly. So we've always had those people. I mean, because of Duncan, those people have always been there. Yeah. And I think the really important thing is the way we have grown to see the shows is, funnily enough, exactly as John described it, John Lack, those years ago, which is we provide the venue, we provide the organisation, but the show is everybody who comes and puts the stuff on.
Absolutely.
The show is the traders, the show is the gamers. If the gamers don't want to come and put the games on, we have no show. If the traders don't make money, we have no show. So, the whole aim of the show is to provide the nicest space with the nicest organisation for them to come and do their stuff.
Yeah.
Which is why I'm always emphasising I try and always emphasise the stuff to do with, it really is the games for me. It's the guys who spend all that time and all that money, and some of them are companies, but a lot of them are just individuals.
Yeah, absolutely.
Huge amounts of time and money they're putting into doing something, just because it looks great and because it gives enjoyment to people.
Also, I think that it was fair to say that the spectrum of games that you guys have at your shows is, I think, broader than most people might think. Because I think back to, obviously, I was part of the group putting on some very, very old school games back in the 2006, 2007, 2008, when we did Sitting Bad and Molvitz, and Charles Grant brought those original Spencer Smiths that had been used in the war game and stuff.
Yeah.
And the crowd we attracted around the table was amazing. I mean, we were just blown away. We didn't get much to play much game. We were just answering so many questions. What's interesting, of course, is that was really at, what was becoming the high watermark of the old school movement that I kind of got shoved towards the pinnacle of, because I'd started my magazine, even though that wasn't quite what I'd had in mind. But and I think that what was really lovely is seeing that people actually, when they get to the show, they're very accepting of something that you might not have associated with Duncan McFarlane's miniature War Games Illustrated front covers and stuff. But actually, I think that your show reflects the fact that gamers actually have a very Catholic, very broad taste in gaming. And a lot of the things that people can find at the Partizan show, I think they might be surprised by. As well, and there's more of a mix. I mean, I think if a bit of blunt promo for the show here, from someone who's actually an impartial observer, is I think that people love your show because there are these surprises. Yes, there's James Morris who's done something absolutely amazing again. Yes, there's Steve Jones who's done something amazing again, and so forth. But there's actually some quite quirky stuff going on as well. Old school, new school. I'm struggling to think off the top of my head because there've just been so many hundreds of games at your show over the years. What for you, in terms of games that you've seen happening at your show, what are some of the highlights that you can remember?
I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think the last couple of years we've had some 40mm games, which are very, very pretty. We actually had a game where all the figures were made out of clothes pegs.
I was thinking of that. Yeah, it was Great Yarmouth. Great Yarmouth, good old boys.
Yarmouth, which, again, I thought was wonderful.
Yeah.
It's just so creative and, harks back to another day. And shows people that you can do things differently. You don't have to buy things off the peg in a box and paint it the way that the box tells you to do it. You can do your own creative stuff, and I guess starting from the sort of Featherstone area, that's great for me because that's part of the hobby as far as I'm concerned. And I'm really happy that you can get pretty much anything you wanted. 30 years ago, I asked the Perrys, "Can you do Swedish Napoleonics?" And they laughed at me. And a few months ago, the first of that range came out. So I'll take credit for inspiring me.
Patience is a virtue.
It is, yeah.
I mean, I suppose for me, I've always had this thing with games that I love miniaturization. That's, funnily enough, where I get it. I used to love going to toy villages and this sort of thing, when little villages. But so for me to see, there's two things. One is to see that detail. I mean, my ideal game, which I've never seen, would be a complete city or a complete town with all the streets and the little vignettes. I just love the little vignettes. That's why I happen to like things like Steve Jones and James Morris and lots of other people who do all these sorts of things, little vignettes in them. But I also love height. So for me, the best game is you walk in. I think there was one that was done by Skirmish Wargames, Mike Blake, back at Kellenberg Hall many years ago. And he'd come along, he didn't want a table, and he bought a frame, which was about 6 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet cube metal frame, which he was doing a sort of a Warhammer 40,000 type thing with, I think there must have been 96mm figures. I mean, they were big figures he was using. And it just looked amazing. So that idea of walking into a wargame show and seeing something that has great height to it, and that has a real sort of both height and depth, a lot of detail and that sort of thing.
Funnily enough, I'm thinking back to Kellenberg Hall, must have been about 2008, 2009, 40mm Peninsula War game. It was a Sharps Rifles thing, and there was a Spanish village on top of a hill. And that was amazing. The French chasseurs were kind of winding up the hill, and there was the house at the top, and there was a ship, I think, in the bay down the bottom. That was really striking.
Paul's, I can't remember. I remember. I can't remember his name now. Paul. I think he used to do a lot of Napoleon stuff. Yeah, beautiful. He was a beautiful model builder. Model maker was his main. And some of his games were just quite incredible. So.
And James, a couple of years ago did Karen, which was virtually
a cliff face, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. It was the Italians in Abyssinia or something, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was an assault virtually up a cliff.
It was incredible.
So that was an amazing table to see.
Yeah. It was, because you actually had to stand next to it to see what was happening on the top level. It was amazing. Also, I think a lot of people... people mustn't think that it's just kind of land warfare that's represented, because there's been all sorts of aerial warfare and stuff. And the thing I remember, was it last year, that amazing Anglo-Dutch naval war game by some of the Grimsby guys, I think it might have been. Because they had a Malburian game as well, but they also did this phenomenal, just hundreds of ships. And as someone who's tried to put together Langton ships... Extraordinary achievement.
I mean, that's the big thing for me, is now that we've got the ability to put on a lot more games, I really am hoping that we get more diversification. We've traditionally, the traders always used to say we were a 28 mil show.
Yeah.
And we've tried to get away from that. Steve Jones used to do quite a lot of 6 mil for a few years. We sometimes get 15 mil, but I'd like to see more, and I'd like to see more of that diversification. I'm very interested. I love the stuff that wargames developments do.
Yeah.
And then, in any way, classic wargames, and quite often they don't even involve figures, but they're brilliant. They're a really good insight into the sort of the military mind and military planning.
Yeah.
That's the stuff I really like.
Yes, I can remember them finding them in little corners, putting on Dam Busters games and stuff. Yeah, fantastic. So, and in fact, you've raising a point that I wanted to move on to, which is, okay, you've reached this, you've landed on the beach, you've got your beachhead in the new venue, so kind of where would you like it to go from here? You've already mentioned diversification. How do you feel about the mix of traders you've got compared to everything else that's going on, for example?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I know lots of traders are very frustrated because they're on a waiting list. They've been on a waiting list for quite a long time in some cases. When we put people on the waiting list, we always warn them. Our criteria for bringing new people in is to maintain show balance.
Yeah.
So there's no point us having 10 booksellers or 10 of anything, really. So we tend to favour people who are doing new and interesting things, bringing their own stuff. As for the future of the show, we would love it if the showground had a hall that was 50% bigger.
Yeah.
But they don't.
Yeah.
I think having moved from as you called it, a labyrinthine sort of creation in Kelham Hall, we're really enjoying having everything in one place.
Yeah.
And I think splitting it up again would be a problem. So these are discussions that we're having all the time with no immediate solution in show. Really.
We will have a look at it. It will depend on what the showground does to some extent. Again, we go back to Hammerhead. They've made a great success of moving over into the pavilion, the Cedric Ford Pavilion. It's not really something we want to do because we don't think, as Laurence said, that splitting the shop in that way would work for us.
Yeah.
We really want something that's seen as an annex.
Yeah.
So one of the options would be, funny enough, going back to what happened at Kelham Hall, would be to have a marquee at one end.
Yeah.
But we would only do that if we were looking for some reason to actually have an expansion, to have more room. So it would be, for example, to bring back some sort of maybe not bring and buy, but sort of a tabletop sale, that sort of thing. It would be to give us more room for things like the societies and the authors, this sort of thing, rather than necessarily to expand the trade. I mean, I'm very conscious of the fact that it's all very well to go to a bigger venue. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get many more people through the door.
Yeah, of course.
It can be a lovely big venue, but if you increase your trade by 50% because you've moved to a bigger space, then everybody's going to suffer.
Yeah.
So, we want it to be an organic growth. We consider we're here for quite a long time, hopefully. We've got no plans to pack up.
Yeah.
So, we'd like to make sure that it grows. If it's going to grow, it does it in a way that sustains everything and keeps, the traders happy and the gamers and all the public. So,
I mean, one of the things that I know some people have asked me is, what's the difference between Partizan and the other Partizan? Is there intended to be a difference, or it's just two shows a year?
About 4 months.
Yeah. The difference is I have much less time to plan the second one every year. It's no. I mean, we basically have the same number of traders. We have the August show has traditionally always been a bit smaller. In terms of the number of people through the door, although that may be changing. It'd be interesting to see how it goes over the next couple of years. But the idea is, and we do have a bit of a change of traders because some people can't make both shows, so we have people coming in their place. But generally, the idea is that we do 2 shows a year, and as long as people are still happy coming to 2 shows a year, and we can particularly get the games to support that. Then we will carry on doing 2 shows.
Because I would have thought one of the problems you could have is that people are coming to the same show, to the 2 shows, that they might turn up at the other Partizan and think, well, hang on a minute, that looks pretty identical to what I saw a couple of months ago.
It's interesting, the games tend not to be the same, though. Even if it's the same people putting on games, they tend to do 2 different games. Yeah. So we do get a very good spread. I can't think of hardly any games that are similar across the 2.
No.
So you're definitely reliant on enthusiasts who are happy to do one splendid-looking game for your first show, bin it, and then do a completely different one for the second.
Yeah, I mean, that's the way it works. Yeah, or we do. I mean, my big concern, obviously, again, when we moved to the showground was being able to get enough games. And within 2 years, I'm now back to a waiting list again. I've had to turn down 3 games for the show, for this next show coming up. So certainly we seem to be able to generate the interest. And I've hardly touched on all the people I know out there who do fantastic games, who put games on at Salute or, in Birmingham or at York. And who basically I've never even got near inviting to Partizan, not because they're not brilliant, but because I just didn't have the room. Yeah. So now if we do start to, I am starting to try and diversify in terms of the people we're inviting as well. So hopefully that will continue and we'll be able to keep putting on that number of games. We have a lot of flexibility. Yeah. To be honest, whether I've got 50 games or 60 games, you're not really going to see the difference in there because we've got the room. We can adjust things so that it still looks nice and full and looks good. So,
yeah, I mean the new venue. One of the advantages of that big open plan space is it is more flexible, isn't it?
Yes,
rather
absolutely.
than at Kelham Hall where it was pretty much what can we squeeze in here a lot of the time, wasn't it? Yeah. Especially interspersed with traders. That's cool. That's brilliant. One of the things that I want to ask, which is getting towards the end, but is quite important, is so you said something about it, you've given an indication, but do you have any specific criteria about the kind of games that you want to see at your show?
I think the answer is no.
No.
I think the history of the show and the reputation we have means that people bring along to Partizan what they think will fit.
Yeah.
So we don't get people doing stuff that doesn't look nice. Even the participation games, I think now, in terms of visual appeal, have been creeping up.
Yeah.
So that's not something we have had people, send us photographs of their games almost as is this good enough to get into your show? But that's never something we've done consciously. No. Yeah. It's something that we've fostered over the years as we've created the atmosphere and developed the show ethos. So it kind of regulates itself.
Yeah, I think you're right there, that people, if anyone's going to put on a game at your show, I think they want to put on their best possible game. The other thing I wanted to mention is that compared to many other shows I've been to, I have to say that the vast majority of the people who are putting on games at Partizan are much better at engaging with the public than at some other shows. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, it's one of the things that we do. I mean, we talk to gamers and we talk to sort of the people doing stuff for us, and we always like them to understand sort of how we want the show to be. Yeah. We want people to come along and feel that they're welcome. One of the big things for us actually with moving up there was to make things easier for wheelchair users. We've got 2 or 3 people who have come to every show at Kelham Hall, in spite of the fact that we knew it was damn near impossible to get around. Yeah. And they persevered, and so we want everybody to be able to get in there and enjoy themselves, and it doesn't matter who they are.
Yeah.
So that's important. I mean, one of the things, just going back to the thing with the games for that, is that there are games that come along that may not be beautifully painted, they may not be sort of magnificent terrain, but they have something. And they're doing something different, and that's just as important. As far as I'm concerned, different is good.
Yeah.
So we like to encourage that as well.
I would agree with that. Is there anything specifically that visitors should be looking out for this show next weekend? Anything that you know about?
I've been trying to highlight a few. I mean, my passion is Back and Beyond. My passion is the sort of the end of the First World War stuff and the 1920s. And there are 2 very good games being put on there.
Okay.
One's being sponsored by Caliber Books, and the other one is being done by the Like a Stonewall guys.
Oh, okay.
They look very exciting because they're sort of my perfect period.
Oh, okay.
Simon Miller's stuff is always great, and the nice thing about Simon's game at this show is he's always been a demonstration gamer.
Yeah.
This time he's bringing effectively a beautiful demonstration game. In fact, 2 games, because he's doing it in 2 separate scales, the same battle.
Oh, wow!
But it's being done as a participation game.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So so there's all sorts of little things like that are going on that we're encouraging people to do.
Is it Ancients or English Civil War this time?
English Civil War. Yeah, it's English Civil War this time. So, I actually looked through the other day, because one of the reasons that we've got the writer's corner, funnily enough, is because I've always traditionally put Harry Sidebottom near the Ancients game, because it's his writing.
Of course, yeah.
I don't have one this year. Oh. This show doesn't, and it really shocked me to realise that at this show I don't actually have an Ancients game. Say it quietly.
Seriously?
But yeah,
that's shocking.
I was amazed. So that won't continue. Don't worry. I'll make sure that we get some Ancients games back.
God.
But it wasn't until I got all the games in and had it all listed that I suddenly realised there wasn't one there for me to put Harry next to.
Oh my God! I'll have to bring my Commands and Colours Ancients and set it up on a little table in the cafe or something. We should mention the catering. Obviously, one of the differences between this venue and the old venue at Kelham Hall is at Kelham Hall, I think there was a bacon sandwich and pretty much nothing else. Yeah. Whereas here, there was a little I mean, it's not. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. It's not cordon bleu, but it's a very workable little sort of cafe that does decent grub.
And that's one of the things that we find the showgrounds very good for, because apart from that, they're very proactive with us about things like simple things like having an ice cream van outside.
Yeah.
It's a little something that helps. There's other little things we're looking at like that might actually be quite themed to our hobby that might work. I'm going to approach the showground about some of these. Just going forward, little ideas. So it is for us. There have been no downsides about the move. It has been excellent for us.
So roughly how many people are you expecting through the door next weekend?
It's always hard to tell. It has, when we were in Kelham Hall, it started to drop off, but it has crept up again. So I would look for 800-900, maybe more for this show. Yeah.
And then we'll have about 200, something upwards of 200, 250 traders and gamers in there as well, who are putting on games and this sort of thing. So
there's going to be over 1,000 people.
Yeah, 1,100 people probably in total. So.
Let's hope it doesn't get too hot then.
No, absolutely, yes.
Yes, you can have Dove selling deodorants at the door, but that's another matter altogether. Commercials plug there. Commercial plug.
No. One other thing actually I would like to mention actually for this show coming up is one of the things we've been approached by is the gents who are doing the Waterloo Uncovered stuff. For those who don't know about this, it's
that Professor Tony Pollard.
That's Tony Pollard. Yeah, I used to work with him, do some archaeology with him many years ago.
Oh, really?
On the 2 Men in a Trench stuff.
Yeah.
And but he and his colleague Midge, they've what they're doing is it's for disabled soldiers or soldiers who've had I think post-traumatic stress disorder or been injured, and they're getting them involved in archaeological digs, and they've been doing some work on Waterloo with that. Yeah. And what they're trying to do is they want to put on sometime I think next year the largest war game that's ever been done. They want to do Waterloo.
It's on Twitter them talking about.
So they're coming along and they're going to have a stand at the show. So Tony Pollard will be there, and so on the society side, they'll be there. So if people would like to come along and see them, I'd strongly recommend that, and maybe give them a bit of support and encouragement.
Oh, absolutely, because I've actually been making friends with Tony on Twitter. We just sort of bumped into each other, as you do on Twitter, into each other. Oh, hello, and saw what he was doing, making Waterloo buildings, and saw him talking about precisely this. He also did an article in Wargame Soldiers and Strategy.
Didn't he? That's right.
A couple of months ago. I can't remember exactly when it was. Oh, well, that's fantastic. Which I shall make a point of going over and saying hello to him and perhaps interviewing him for the post show thing that I do. I think I'm going to collect and amass so much material at next weekend. I'm going to be making stuff out of it for months to come. But you won't mind that. With luck, I'll have finished doing it in time for the next. The other Partizan, and we'll start all over again. Anyway, guys, that's absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. That's been a brilliant chat.
Thank you.
No problem at all. Really informative. I think it's given people a lot of kind of useful background information about the show. And, I just wish you all the luck in the world in the new venue. It's been a couple of years already that you've been there. Seems to be kind of picking up. That's brilliant. From my point of view, obviously, I'm going to encourage anyone out there who's listening to this and watching this to come along to the name of the venue is...
It's the George Stephenson Pavilion at Newark Showground. So as you approach Newark, loads of road signs that say Showground. It's easy to find.
It is, actually. There's a big roundabout with a garage on the corner, isn't there?
There is indeed.
Yeah, it's
just up the road from that, and turn right. And I did feel so sorry for Sally and Paul of Callistra, who were organising Hammerhead, and at the last minute, the police actually said, no, it's too dangerous for anyone to go down there, which is quite something, really. But we shouldn't have any such troubles in mid-May, we hope. Though the weather's been really strange lately. And so it's Sunday, the 20th of May, 2018, and the doors open at 10 o'clock?
10 a.m., yeah.
10 a.m. So, folks, if you've not been to the show before, make sure that you get there. Trix and Laurence, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much.
See you next week.
Fantastic, and we'll see you next week. Cheers, everybody.
Bye.